A U.S. official confirmed it on the record this week, in language that leaves very little room for doubt about the scale of what's actually happened. Iran has now shot down roughly 30 American MQ-9 Reaper drones since this war began, and it just added another one to that list in the middle of a fresh round of strikes that President Trump himself just confirmed ended any remaining pretense of a ceasefire. This is a genuinely major and significant escalation, and I want to walk you through exactly what got shot down, what it cost, why Tehran keeps managing to pull this off, and why the fact that it's happened this many times is a much bigger story than any single downed aircraft on its own. Let's start with the number itself, because it's honestly staggering once you actually sit with it and compare it against how small the total American Reaper fleet actually was to begin with long before this war ever started. According to ABC News, a U.S. official confirmed Wednesday that Iran has downed roughly 30 American MQ-9 Reaper drones since the start of this war. Iran claimed to have shot down one Reaper during U.S. strikes on Tuesday, and Iranian state media separately claimed an additional unnamed enemy drone was shot down over southern Iran during a fresh round of strikes on Wednesday. That's two claimed shootdowns in the span of roughly 24 hours, layered on top of a total that had already climbed to roughly 30 aircraft. And this news didn't happen in isolation. It landed at the exact moment the fragile ceasefire that had briefly quieted this war collapsed for good, adding yet another layer of tension to an already deteriorating situation. ABC News reported that the U.S. carried out another round of strikes against Iran on Wednesday, after President Trump signaled that the ceasefire, which had been shaky from the very beginning and repeatedly punctured by strikes and counterstrikes on both sides, was officially over. CENTCOM put out a statement on social media that same day explaining the reasoning in plain terms. The United States is holding Iran accountable for recent unjustified aggression against commercial shipping and civilian crews freely navigating a vital international waterway. So the newest drone losses aren't some isolated technical mishap. They're happening in the exact same breath as a formal declaration that this war is back on, in full, after Iran kept targeting tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Let's talk about why losing Reaper drones specifically matters so much here, because this isn't just any aircraft we're talking about. According to ABC News, the Reaper entered Air Force service officially back in 2007 and has functioned as an absolute genuine centerpiece of American counterterrorism operations across the Middle East and other conflict zones for nearly 2 decades, reflecting the military's growing reliance on unmanned aircraft that really took hold during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was designed from the very beginning to operate in environments where the United States had already established clear air dominance, flying low and slow for hours at a time, gathering intelligence, tracking targets, sometimes carrying Hellfire missiles or guided bombs of its own. That entire design philosophy depends on one basic assumption, that nothing on the ground below can actually reach up and touch it. That assumption is exactly what Iran has spent this entire war disproving, over and over again. As one Air Force general put it directly to Congress, the Reaper has become what he called a most valuable player in this specific conflict, precisely because no other American platform has flown nearly as many missions or absorbed nearly as much risk. According to that same congressional testimony reported by ABC News, Air Force Chief of Staff General Kenneth Wilsbach told lawmakers during a budget hearing back in May that no other platform is even close to the Reaper in terms of how many strikes it's enabled throughout this war. But here's the trade-off. Nobody wants to say out loud in that same hearing room. The more you lean on a single platform to carry that much of the war's weight, the more losses you're going to rack up when the enemy figures out how to reliably shoot it down. And Iran has clearly figured that out. Let's talk about the money here too, because the scale of the financial loss is genuinely enormous, even before you get to the deeper strategic implications sitting underneath all of it. According to Bloomberg, Iran had already destroyed more than 24 MQ-9 Reaper drones by late May, a loss worth nearly $1 billion, representing roughly 20% of the Pentagon's entire pre-war inventory of this specific aircraft. Bloomberg's reporting, citing a person with direct knowledge of the matter, noted that many of those drones were shot down mid-flight by Iranian fire, while others were destroyed on the ground during Iranian missile strikes on the bases where they were stationed, and a smaller number were lost to accidents. That 20% figure is worth sitting with for a second, because it means roughly 1 out of every 5 Reaper drones the United States had available anywhere in the world before this war started has now either been shot out of the sky or blown up on the ground specifically because of this conflict with Iran. And replacing them isn't as simple as just ordering more off an assembly line somewhere either. ABC News and OODA Loop both reported that the Air Force signed its final 5-year purchasing contract for Reapers back in 2020, and that manufacturer General Atomics actually closed the production line entirely last year after building 575 of them in total. According to a General Atomics spokesman, the final production lot cost roughly $16 million per aircraft when purchased in a batch of 4, though other reporting on the broader program has put the more typical unit cost closer to $30 million each once you factor in the full history of the contract. Either way, you're talking about a finite, aging fleet, with the actual factory line that built them already shut down, meaning every single Reaper Iran manages to shoot down or destroy on the ground is genuinely, permanently gone from that inventory. There's no quick way to just build more. Let's get into how Iran has actually and truly been pulling this off, because that's really the core of why this counts as such a significant escalation, rather than just an unfortunate accumulation of bad luck over several months of otherwise routine, low-risk surveillance flights. Middle East Eye reported that a U.S. official told the New York Times that Iranian military commanders may have been mapping out the flight patterns of American fighter jets and bombers over their skies, essentially learning and adapting to how the U.S. moves through Iranian airspace over time. If that's accurate, it means Iran isn't getting lucky with occasional lucky shots. It's building an actual operating picture of American flight behavior and using that pattern recognition to improve its odds against a slower, lower-flying, unmanned aircraft, like the Reaper specifically. That detail matters even more when you remember what President Trump has repeatedly claimed publicly throughout this war, that Iran's air defenses have been, in his own words, obliterated. Middle East Eye's reporting pointed out directly that Iran's continued ability to shoot down Reaper drones stands as a pretty clear demonstration that Tehran has managed to keep some functional air defense capability intact, despite months of American and Israeli strikes specifically targeting that exact kind of infrastructure. You can't have it both ways. Either Iran's air defenses are genuinely gone, or they're not, and every additional Reaper that gets shot out of the sky is hard, physical evidence pointing toward the second option. I want to walk you through one of the specific incidents that shows exactly how these engagements have actually unfolded, because the play-by-play here is honestly pretty remarkable. According to reporting picked up by Common Dreams, citing an analysis from Hamidreza Azizi, a foreign policy expert and visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, one particular exchange back in May unfolded in several rounds, over roughly 24 hours. It started when CENTCOM announced it had conducted what it called self-defense strikes in southern Iran, explaining that American forces were acting to protect U.S. troops from threats posed by Iranian forces, specifically targeting missile launch sites and Iranian boats that were attempting to plant sea mines. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded, according to that same reporting, by firing anti-ship missiles at American vessels in the area. Iranian air defense systems then shot down at least one U.S. drone operating nearby, with some reports suggesting as many as 3 were downed during that specific exchange. American forces then struck back against the Iranian anti-ship missile launch sites and air defense systems responsible, and Iran responded again after that. That's not a single clean incident. That's an escalating back-and-forth exchange playing out over a full day, with drone losses functioning as just one visible marker inside a much larger, continuously unfolding fight. And the IRGC's own public statements from around that same period tell you exactly how Tehran wants this entire story framed for both domestic and international audiences watching closely. Common Dreams reported that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said in a statement carried by Iranian news agencies that it had downed an MQ-9 Reaper drone, and had also fired upon a separate RQ-4 surveillance drone, as well as what it called an intruding F-35 fighter jet. The IRGC specifically cast all of those actions as purely defensive, claiming it has the right to, in its own words, respond to any ceasefire violation by the aggressor, U.S. Army. Whether or not you buy that framing, it tells you Iran isn't hiding these engagements or downplaying them. It's actively publicizing every single one, using each downed drone as a propaganda point to argue that its military is still capable of standing up to direct American pressure, ceasefire or no ceasefire. Let's talk about geography for a second, because where these shootdowns are actually happening matters just as much as how many of them have occurred across this entire war so far. A separate incident reported through open-source military tracking described Iranian forces shooting down a trespassing American drone near the southern city of Bushehr, with Tasnim news agency citing a military source who confirmed the interception was carried out through the launch of an air defense missile directly at the aircraft. Iran's Fars news agency, covering that same incident, credited the country's integrated air defense system, describing how the network confronted the aircraft using air defense positions specifically deployed near the cities of Jam and Kangan, both inside Bushehr province. That incident reportedly happened just one day after Iranian forces turned back an American tanker that had attempted, according to the report, to illegally cross the Strait of Hormuz with its own tracking system switched off. American forces responded to that same overall episode by striking an open area near the southern Iranian port city of Bandar Abbas. Bushehr specifically keeps coming up throughout this war for a reason that goes beyond just this one shoot-down. It's home to Iran's primary nuclear power facility, and the province surrounding it, stretching along the northern edge of the Persian Gulf, has become one of the most heavily defended and most fiercely contested stretches of airspace anywhere in this entire conflict. When you understand that Bushehr sits right along some of the most sensitive Iranian territory in the entire war, it makes complete sense that Iran would concentrate especially dense air defense coverage in exactly that area. And it makes just as much sense that American drones flying reconnaissance missions anywhere near Bushehr would face the highest concentration of exactly the kind of layered air defense systems capable of reliably tracking and engaging a Reaper. Let's get into the technical reasons why Iran has been able to pull this off so consistently, because it's not just persistence or luck. According to defense industry reporting from Defense Security Asia, the MQ-9 possesses a genuinely large radar signature, limited maneuverability, and a cruising speed that simply isn't fast enough to evade a modern missile's engagement envelope once it's been locked onto. Its entire operational profile requires prolonged loitering directly above a designated surveillance area, which creates exactly the kind of predictable, repeatable flight pattern that gives Iranian radar operators extra time to identify and intercept it. That same reporting noted that the Reaper's reliance on satellite communications and remote control links adds another layer of vulnerability too, because Iranian electronic warfare units can attempt jamming and data link interference on top of a direct missile shot, and several analysts believe some of these American drone losses may actually be the result of combined electronic attack and missile engagement working together rather than a clean, single kinetic intercept. That same analysis pointed out something worth sitting with directly. The Reaper was originally built for permissive counterinsurgency environments, flying over insurgent groups in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia, where American commanders could reasonably assume uninterrupted air and electromagnetic superiority the entire time. Iran is a fundamentally different kind of battlespace. Its layered air defense architecture reportedly combines long-range missile batteries, mobile medium-range interceptors, passive sensors that give off very little warning, and dedicated electronic warfare systems, built around domestically produced platforms like the Bavar 373 and the Khordad series systems, alongside older Russian-designed components, all of it specifically capable of tracking a slow, predictable, non-stealthy target, exactly like the Reaper. I also want to walk you through just how genuinely valuable this platform has been to the American war effort, because that's really what makes each loss sting so much. According to sourcing from Air and Space Forces magazine picked up by Tech Times, Reapers flew roughly a dozen separate orbits over Iran at any given moment during the peak of this campaign, each one capable of remaining aloft for more than 24 hours at a stretch. Those orbits were focused on two central jobs: striking mobile missile and drone launchers that would appear and disappear within minutes, and feeding real-time targeting intelligence to manned strike aircraft that simply couldn't loiter nearly as long. That same reporting described more than 4,000 of this campaign's total target, set as what the military calls dynamic targets, mobile systems that show up on the battlefield and have to be engaged almost immediately. And Reapers were reportedly central to covering that entire category of threat. There's one specific detail from that reporting that I think really captures what this aircraft has actually meant to American forces on the ground throughout this war. According to people familiar with the operations who spoke to Air and Space Forces magazine, a Reaper helped shield the weapons system officer of a downed F-15E Strike Eagle, actively engaging Iranian military personnel who had closed to within 3 kilometers of the downed airmen on the ground. That's not abstract intelligence gathering happening somewhere far away from the fight. That's a drone directly protecting an American aircrew member in real time during a genuine rescue situation, which tells you exactly why the Air Force keeps flying these missions despite the mounting losses. The capability this aircraft provides isn't easily replaced by anything else currently in the American inventory, and every time one gets shot down, that specific kind of coverage, the kind that can mean the difference between a downed airman surviving or not, becomes just a little bit thinner across the rest of the theater. Let's zoom out and talk about what this pattern of losses actually does to how the United States can keep fighting this war going forward, because I think that's the piece that matters most, beyond just the individual headlines about each new shootdown. The entire value of a platform like the Reaper comes from persistence, the ability to loiter over a target area for hours at a time, watching, tracking, waiting for the right moment to strike or to pass along intelligence to a manned aircraft nearby. Every single time Iran successfully shoots one down, that's not just the loss of a $30 million aircraft. It's a gap in coverage over whatever stretch of Iranian territory that specific drone was supposed to be watching, a gap that has to get filled by something else, whether that's a more expensive manned aircraft taking on more risk, a satellite reallocating its coverage, or simply accepting reduced visibility over that area until another asset can be repositioned. And when you're losing them at the pace suggested by these numbers, roughly 30 aircraft gone since this war started, representing a full fifth of the entire pre-war inventory, with the actual factory that built them already closed for good, you start to understand why some analysts are describing this as more than just an unfortunate cost of doing business. It's a genuine attrition problem, the kind that eventually forces harder decisions about how aggressively to keep flying that specific platform into contested Iranian airspace, especially in the exact regions, like the skies around Bushehr, where Iran has proven it can reliably reach these aircraft. Let's also talk about a pattern that's honestly one of the more alarming threads running through this whole story right now, which is that Iran hasn't just been shooting these drones out of the sky one at a time in the air. It's also been going after them on the ground, in bulk, in a single strike. Defense industry reporting on a mid-July incident described how Iranian forces targeted Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan directly, with the IRGC framing a renewed salvo against that same base on July 9th as what it called the second phase of its retaliation, followed just 3 days later by a separate strike against shared hangar infrastructure at Prince Hassan Air Base. That same reporting described this as part of an accelerating, costly attrition curve, with global defense planners reportedly reassessing how hardened aircraft shelters and dispersal doctrine for high-value unmanned assets are actually built, specifically because of how precisely Iran has been able to target fixed drone infrastructure across multiple separate strikes on the ground, rather than just picking them off individually in the air. That's a genuinely different and, in some ways, more efficient method of attrition than shooting down drones one at a time during individual missions. If Iran can reliably strike a hangar or a maintenance facility holding multiple Reapers at once, a single successful missile strike accomplishes in one shot what would otherwise take dozens of separate aerial engagements to achieve. And that pattern lines up directly with what Bloomberg reported back in May, that a meaningful share of the destroyed Reapers weren't lost mid-flight at all, but were instead destroyed on the ground during Iranian missile strikes, specifically targeting the bases where American forces had them stationed. I also want to bring in one more specific incident because it shows how quickly Iran has been willing to publicize even a single shoot-down for maximum propaganda value. The Jerusalem Post reported that the IRGC claimed it had downed an MQ-9 Reaper after identifying what it called a hostile aircraft entering Iranian airspace over the Gulf region, and in that same statement claimed it had also fired at an F-35 fighter jet, forcing it to leave Iranian airspace, along with a separate RQ-4 intelligence collection drone. The IRGC specifically said it reserved what it called the legitimate and definite right to retaliate against any ceasefire violations by the United States, framing all three actions as a direct response to American self-defense strikes that had been carried out overnight against Iranian boats attempting to lay mines in various missile launch sites. It's worth noting Washington did not confirm every detail of that specific claim, and Tehran has a clear incentive to inflate its own successes for both domestic and international audiences. But even accounting for that healthy skepticism, the pattern across multiple separate incidents, confirmed independently by American officials in several of these cases, leaves very little doubt that the core trend, mounting Reaper losses over the course of this war, is real. Let's also talk about where Iran has reportedly concentrated some of its heaviest losses, because it isn't spread evenly across the entire country. Separate defense reporting described two of the more significant recent shootdowns occurring near Isfahan, an area that's become absolutely central to Iran's wartime defensive strategy, specifically because of its concentration of military and nuclear-related facilities. Iran has reportedly spent years building overlapping air defense zones around Isfahan, combining radar coverage, surface-to-air missile batteries, mobile launchers, and dispersed command and control nodes, all layered on top of each other, specifically to protect that stretch of territory. When American officials acknowledged the widening scale of these losses, they continued to argue that the broader campaign, known as Operation Epic Fury, had still meaningfully degraded Iran's missile capabilities, naval assets, and long-range strike infrastructure across multiple operational theaters, even while conceding the attrition problem with the Reaper fleet specifically was real and getting worse. And there's one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning, because it points toward where Iran's air defense capability might be heading next, rather than just where it's been. Separate defense industry reporting described what it called Iran's secretive Arash-e-Kamagir surface-to-air missile system, allegedly responsible for downing an MQ-9 Reaper in an incident tied to the Strait of Hormuz specifically. Open-source analysis referenced in that reporting suggested the system may incorporate a multi-mode active electronically scanned array radar, capable of simultaneously searching for, tracking, and engaging multiple targets at once, representing what that reporting described as a new mobile air defense doctrine for Tehran going forward. That same reporting noted the system reportedly competed against alternative designs linked to Iran's Army and IRGC procurement pipeline, reflecting ongoing internal debates inside Iran's military establishment about mobility, missile range, survivability, and production costs. as the country continues trying to adapt its air defenses in real time, in the middle of an active war, rather than simply relying on whatever systems it had stockpiled before this conflict even started. I also think it's worth mentioning how this fits into the broader pattern of losses the United States has absorbed throughout this entire war, because the Reaper isn't the only aircraft that's gone down. ABC News noted directly that the U.S. has lost several aircraft throughout this conflict beyond just the Reapers, including an incident where Kuwaiti air defenses mistakenly shot down 3 American F-15E Strike Eagles in a friendly fire accident amid the chaos of an engagement, with the American air crews thankfully surviving. Open-source tracking of the broader war has also documented Italy losing one of its own MQ-9 Reaper drones during Iranian strikes on Kuwait, alongside damage to 2 Eurofighter Typhoon jets. So the picture that emerges isn't just Iran successfully targeting American drones in isolation. It's a genuinely chaotic, high-tempo air war, with losses coming from enemy action, from friendly fire, and from the sheer difficulty of coordinating that many aircraft from that many different countries across such a contested stretch of airspace, night after night, for months on end. Let's talk honestly about what this means for how the rest of this war might play out, because I don't want to leave you with just a pile of numbers and no sense of where this actually goes from here. On one hand, the Reaper losses genuinely validate a real Iranian capability, proof that Tehran retained functioning air defenses despite claims to the contrary, and proof that Iranian commanders have been studying and adapting to American flight patterns over time, rather than just reacting blindly in the moment. On the other hand, it's worth being honest that losing an unmanned drone, however expensive, is a fundamentally different kind of cost than losing a crewed aircraft and its pilot. And I think it's worth pausing on that distinction a little longer, because it explains almost everything about why this war has continued at this pace, despite such a significant material cost being racked up on the American side. If Iran were shooting down 30 crewed fighter jets instead of 30 unmanned drones, this conversation in Washington would look completely different, with enormous political pressure building almost immediately to either dramatically escalate or pull back entirely. Losing an unmanned aircraft generates real financial pain, real strategic frustration, and genuine embarrassment for a country that spent years insisting its air defenses had been effectively destroyed. But it doesn't generate the same kind of domestic political crisis that a rising body count among American pilots would. That's precisely why the Pentagon has been able to keep absorbing these losses, month after month, without the broader war effort itself grinding to a halt over public outcry the way it might if these were manned missions instead. Every one of these 30 shootdowns represents a real financial and intelligence loss for the United States, but not a single one of them represents an American life lost in the process, and that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to understand how much genuine pressure this actually puts on Washington's willingness to keep fighting, compared to how much pressure it puts specifically on the defense budget and the industrial base trying to keep pace with the losses. And that's really the tension sitting underneath this entire story right now, the part that I think explains almost everything about why this specific war keeps grinding forward the way it does. Iran gets to claim a genuine, verifiable military success every single time one of these drones goes down, a real propaganda win it can point to as proof its military hasn't been broken, the way American officials have claimed. The United States, meanwhile, absorbs a real financial and intelligence cost each time, but loses no personnel in the process, meaning the domestic political pressure to actually stop flying these missions stays much lower than it would if American air crews were the ones being put at risk. That asymmetry is exactly why you're likely to keep seeing headlines like this one, roughly 30 Reapers down and climbing, even as the broader war grinds on, with neither side showing much sign of a clean, decisive end coming anytime soon. There's also a longer-term question worth raising here, one that goes beyond just this specific war with Iran. If a determined mid-tier regional power with a layered but not especially advanced air defense network can reliably shoot down a fifth of America's entire Reaper fleet within the span of several months, that has implications for how the United States thinks about deploying similar unmanned platforms against any future adversary with even more sophisticated air defenses than Iran currently has. The Reaper was built for a different kind of war, against opponents who couldn't meaningfully contest the airspace above them, and this conflict has become something close to a real-world stress test of what happens when that assumption stops being true. The lessons the Air Force draws from this specific attrition curve about survivability, about hardened basing, about how many eggs to put in one unmanned basket, are likely to shape how the next generation of American drones gets designed and deployed for years after this particular war with Iran is eventually over. So where does this leave things right now with the ceasefire declared over and fresh strikes already underway on both sides of this fast-moving, still unfolding conflict? Iran has proven, repeatedly and publicly, that it can still reach American drones flying over its territory, especially in heavily defended corridors like the airspace around Bushehr. The United States has proven just as repeatedly that it's willing to keep flying those same missions anyway, treating each loss as an acceptable cost of maintaining the kind of persistent surveillance and strike capability that the Reaper provides, even as the factory that built them sits closed, and the remaining inventory keeps shrinking one shoot-down at a time. Whether that trade continues to make sense for Washington as the total climbs past 30, toward 40, toward whatever number eventually starts to feel unsustainable, is a question that's going to keep getting asked with every single new report, like the one we just covered today. I want to know what you think happens from here. Do you think the United States keeps flying Reaper missions into contested Iranian airspace at the same pace, despite these mounting losses? Or do you think a fleet already down 20% with no new production line to replace it eventually forces a real change in how these missions get flown? There's a genuine case for both directions. The case for continuing as is rests on exactly what we covered today, a platform that's proven irreplaceable for force protection and dynamic targeting, with no personnel casualties attached to any of these losses, meaning the political cost of continuing stays remarkably low, even as the financial cost keeps climbing. The case for a real change rests on the sheer math of a closed production line and a shrinking inventory, combined with mounting evidence that Iran's mobile, adaptive air defense doctrine, from the Bavar 373 to the newer Arashi Commandeer system, is only getting better at exploiting exactly the kind of predictable flight profile that makes the Reaper so vulnerable in the first place. Let me know down in the comments, because I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear where people land on this. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and if you want to keep following exactly how this story develops night by night, in what has become one of the most closely watched and fastest moving conflicts anywhere in the world right now, I'll keep laying it out for you here, sourced and verified the same way I did today. I'll see you in the next one.